Marco Vicenzino is the executive director of a think tank called the Global Strategy Project. He joins me now in the studio to talk about the NATO summit's announcements on Afghanistan. So the suggestion that they can come up with a 2014 date for pulling out combat troops, how realistic is that?
In my opinion, not very realistic. Much of it is driven and motivated by domestic internal needs of many of the countries, particularly the leading ones. That's in the United States. Obviously, President Obama has had some difficulties in recent weeks with internal politics, but much of that agenda, the schedule that was set, is driven by domestic political factors.
And how much is this something where the countries, could actually, if they stayed in longer, make more of a difference? I mean, is it partly giving the people, the Taliban, for instance, the chance to think, right, well, we've only got to hold out until 2014 if they're given a deadline like that?
Any deadlines, there's two deadlines. There's one in July 2011 that was announced by President Obama last year, and now there's this recent deadline of a beginning of transferring of full power to Afghan forces. In my opinion, both of them are not realistic. They're counterproductive, because what they do is that they incentivize the insurgency to hold out as long as they could, and disincentivizes ordinary Afghans from wanting to collaborate and participate with the international mission.
Now, one commentator writing in European Voice has argued that actually we should be entering a post-NATO era, and that NATO has actually failed in Afghanistan, and the organisation is just not worth the money. Would you agree with that view?
No, a world without NATO would be a far more unstable world. NATO is not a perfect organization. There are many difficulties with NATO, many problems, but I would say it's better to have a NATO than not to have a NATO.
What he goes on to argue is that essentially people aren't sharing the burden, and that in the end the US, if it wants to do anything anywhere, could just go to particular countries and get the help, because he says that some of these countries are not pulling their weight anyway.
Grievances, like I said, the legitimate grievances, we can call them the NATO skeptics. Perhaps the NATO skeptics do have many legitimate grievances, but once again, if you remove the organization completely, it'll be a far more unstable world. You need to address many of the difficulties. There needs to be a lot more burden sharing and prevent many of the countries that you can call them perhaps free riders of security. That needs to be addressed, and it needs to be fundamentally addressed. And if it's not addressed, not only in this conference, but in coming years, and it deals with budgets. There are many difficulties with budgets that one needs to be realistic about.
Yeah, because that's the problem at the moment, is that in the age of austerity in Europe, presumably people have been even more reluctant to commit troops to whether it's combat or kind of continuing training in places like Afghanistan.
Over 50% of European defence spending is by the UK and France. And the UK and France, I think, are setting the lead, because recently we've seen a lot more cooperation, a lot more integration. For example, aircraft carriers, there was an announcement by both countries to share and to reduce the cost. You have to prevent overlapping, streamline a lot of the waste, and that's the only way it can be done. So I think with Europe and France setting the example in Europe, for an era of austerity, can be a lot more efficient, but you need to be focused, and I don't think the focus is there yet.
And do you think within the context of what they're doing with Russia, do you think they're setting a new kind of front for NATO, or do you think it's not going to change a huge amount in the way relations
are? With Russia, there needs to be cooperation, greater cooperation. We can't speak about integration or involvement of Russia as a part of NATO yet. For me, that's too naive. Russia, obviously, when we talk about NATO, we talk about democratic countries and the rule of law. And a country like Russia, still, it's more of an arbitrary application of the rule of law.
Okay, Marco Vicenzino, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts.